My name is Chester, and I am 66 years old. For 40 of those years I was a ghost, a quiet, uniformed ghost sitting behind the wheel of a polished black Bentley. My job, if you could call it that, was to be the personal driver for Mr. Alistair Abernathy, a man so wealthy he could afford the ultimate luxury and visibility. And in his world I was a part of the upholstery, a feature of the car, a silent presence that opened doors and navigated the sprawling city without ever truly being seen. My family, of course, saw me, and they were not impressed. To my children and later my nephew, my life's work was a source of quiet, persistent shame. I wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't build things or run a company. I was, in their carefully chosen words, in service. A polite, archaic term that tasted like pity. When the old man died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92, the silence he left behind was deafening. He had no children, no living relatives, he acknowledged. There was just me, his lawyer, Mr. Finch, and a handful of household staff who had served him for decades. We were the ones who truly mourned him, not for the titan of industry the newspapers wrote about, but for the quiet, fiercely private man who knew the names of my grandchildren and always asked if my old Ford was running well. The reading of the will was a formality, or so I thought. I assumed the vast Abernathy fortune would be funneled into the various charities he supported. I was there as a courtesy, a witness to the final chapter of a life I had observed from the driver's seat. My daughter Brenda and my nephew Marcus insisted on coming. They said it was to support me, but their eyes scanned the opulent law office of Finch, Abernathy, and Croft with a greedy curiosity that made my stomach tighten. They looked like tourists in a land they felt they were owed a piece of. Finch, a man as old and elegant as the leather-bound books that lined his walls, cleared his throat. He read through a few minor bequests to the staff, generous but not life-changing sums. Then he paused, adjusted his spectacles, and looked directly at me. He said, "As to the remainder of my estate, including all properties, liquid assets, stock portfolios, and personal effects, I leave it in its entirety to my most loyal friend and trusted confidant, Mr. Chester Morrison." The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth out of the space. I felt my own blood drain from my face. I must have misheard. It was impossible. Brenda, sitting beside me, made a small choking sound. Marcus, who had been leaning back in his chair with a look of bored entitlement, sat bolt upright. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Could you repeat that, Mr. Finch?" Ever the professional, didn't even flinch. He repeated the clause, word for word. The entire Abernathy estate. To me, the driver. The shock on my family's faces curdled, in a matter of seconds, into a grotesque mask of outrage. Brenda's hand, which had been resting on my arm in a pantomime of support, snatched back as if she'd been burned. "That's absurd," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "This is a mistake." He was an old man. He was clearly not in his right mind. Marcus was already on his feet, his face flushed a dark, ugly red. "This is undue influence. It's elder abuse. My uncle was a chauffeur, for God's sake. This is a heist." I just sat there, frozen. I couldn't process the number Mr. Finch had mentioned, a figure so vast it seemed like a joke. All I could feel was the searing heat of my own family's contempt. For 40 years my job had been a source of shame for them, and now, the ultimate reward for that service, the profound, earth-shattering validation from the only man whose opinion ever truly mattered to me, was just another reason for them to look down on me. They didn't see it as a gift. They saw it as something I had stolen. The storm broke right there in the lawyer's office. The carefully constructed facade of family loyalty evaporated, revealing the raw, grasping greed that lay beneath. They didn't mourn the death of a great man. They mourned the death of a fantasy, a jackpot they suddenly felt they were owed. And in their eyes, I wasn't their father or their uncle. I was the hired help who had just run off with the family silver. Their sudden materialization at the news of Mr. Abernethy's death had been an audition, and now that the will was read, their true performance was beginning. They demanded their share. They threatened to contest the will, and they made it clear that they would drag my name, and the name of my deceased friend, through the mud to get what they wanted. I drove home from that meeting in a daze, my old Ford feeling flimsy and foreign after decades in the solid, silent embrace of a Bentley. The phone started ringing before I even got the key in my front door. It was Brenda. Her voice, usually dripping with practiced patience for her simple old dad, was sharp and brittle. "Dad, you have to do the right thing," she started. "No preamble. No how are you feeling. This is a mistake. And you know it. Mr. Abernathy was like family to us all, and this money should stay in the family." I gripped the phone, the cheap plastic groaning under the pressure. Mr. Abernathy was like family. Brenda had met him exactly twice in 40 years, both times at company Christmas functions where she and her husband spent the entire evening networking with junior executives, barely giving the old man the time of day. They saw him as a stepping stone, a contact, never as a person. "Brenda," I said, my own voice sounding distant and hollow, "Mr. Finch just read his final wishes. I don't think it was a mistake." "Don't be naive, Dad," she snapped, and the mask was gone completely now. "He was a senile old man, and you took advantage of him. Everyone will see it that way. A court will see it that way. You're going to be humiliated." The call ended with her spitting a threat about lawyers and public disgrace. Not 10 minutes later, my nephew Marcus called. His approach was different, a greasy, condescending tone that was somehow even more insulting. "Chester," he began, and the fact he didn't call me Uncle Al was a clear signal. "Let's be smart about this. You're not equipped to handle this kind of wealth. It's a burden. It's complicated. You've been a driver your whole life. What do you know about managing a global portfolio?" He then laid out his proposal. A simple solution, he called it. I would agree to sign over the bulk of the estate to a trust, which he, with his business acumen, would graciously manage on behalf of the family. I would be given a generous allowance, a pension, and could even keep the main house. He said it as if he were bestowing a great favor upon me. "It's the only way to keep this from getting messy, Chester," he finished, his voice slick with false concern. "We don't want to have to prove in open court that Mr. Abernathy had lost his mind and that you were whispering in his ear for years. It would be embarrassing for everyone." I hung up the phone without saying another word. The silence of my small, tidy house pressed in on me. For 40 years I had swallowed their slights, their little humiliations. I'd done it for a simple reason, a promise I'd made to my late wife, Eleanor, on her deathbed. She was the glue of our family, the one who smoothed over every rough edge. "Just keep them close, Chester," she had whispered, her hand frail in mine. "Family is all that matters in the end. Don't let pride get in the way." And so I hadn't. I let their pride run roughshod over mine for decades. I still remembered the sting of my grandson's career day at school. My daughter Brenda had called me the night before, her voice a symphony of awkward excuses. "Dad, it's just, you know how the other parents are. Lawyers, surgeons. It might be better if Frank goes. His marketing job is, well, it's more relatable for the kids." She didn't want a chauffeur standing next to the investment bankers and the tech CEOs. She didn't want her son's friends to know that his grandfather was the help. I hadn't argued. I just said I understood that I had to work anyway. I spent that day driving Mr. Abernathy to a series of tedious board meetings, the quiet shame churning in my gut like sour milk. Mr. Abernathy, perceptive as always, had noticed my mood. "Something troubling you, Chester?" he'd asked, his voice a low rumble from the back seat. I almost lied, but something in his tone made me tell the truth. I told him about career day. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "The world is full of people who confuse a title with a man's worth. Their loss, not yours." The next day, A brand new top-of-the-line set of professional-grade tools arrived at my house with a simple handwritten note, "For a man who knows how to build things that last." Allah, it was for my hobby, woodworking, something I did in my garage to keep my hands busy. A hobby Brenda called a nice little pastime and Marcus called making fancy firewood. Mr. Abernathy had paid more attention to my life from the back of a car than my own family had from across the dinner table. I thought about the Christmases, the family gatherings where Marcus, flush with his latest get-rich-quick scheme, would hold court. He'd clap me on the shoulder, his grip a little too tight, his smile a little too wide. "Uncle Chester, still driving that old tank around, you ought to let me get you into a real investment. Turn that driver's salary into a real nest egg." He never saw the irony. The old tank I drove was worth more than his entire condo, and the man in the back of it could buy and sell Marcus's sure thing ventures without noticing the rounding error. Their disdain was a constant low hum in the background of my life. My uniform was a source of mockery. My steady, reliable 40-year career was a failure in their eyes because it lacked the glamour of a corner office. I had paid for Brenda's college tuition, co-signed for Marcus's first business loan, a loan he defaulted on, leaving me to clean up the mess. I did it all because of my promise to Eleanor. I kept them close, no matter the cost to my own dignity. But sitting there, in the deafening silence after their threatening calls, I realized something profound. They weren't just insulting me anymore. They were threatening to desecrate the memory of the one person who had shown me consistent, unwavering respect. They wanted to paint Alistair Abernathy as a doddering old fool and me as a manipulative parasite. They weren't just trying to take the money. They were trying to rewrite my life story, to erase the genuine friendship that was the proudest achievement of my later years. A cold, hard resolve began to form in my chest, displacing the shock and the hurt. It felt like a piece of steel crystallizing in my soul. They had mistaken my quiet patience for weakness. They had mistaken my loyalty to a promise for stupidity. They thought I was still the same simple man in a driver's cap who would just hand over the keys because they demanded them. The final formal letter from their lawyer arrived by courier 2 days later. It was filled with legal jargon, testamentary capacity, undue influence, fiduciary misconduct. It was a declaration of war, and as I read the words, I felt the last vestiges of my old self, the compliant, peacekeeping father and uncle, fall away. Eleanor had asked me to keep the family together, but this wasn't family anymore. This was a pack of wolves circling, and they had just made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the old sheepdog had no teeth. It wasn't about revenge when the will was read. It wasn't even about the money. But in that moment, holding that piece of paper, it became about justice. It was about defending the honor of a dead friend, and for the first time in a very long time defending my own. My first call wasn't to Brenda or Marcus. It was to Mr. Finch. I met him back at his office the next morning. The air was different now. The look he gave me wasn't one of pity for the bereaved employee. It was one of camaraderie, of a shared purpose. "Chester," he said, his voice firm. "I knew Alistair for over 50 years. His mind was as sharp as a diamond tack until the very end. This challenge is an insult, and we will fight it." "They're painting a picture of me as some kind of predator," I said, the words feeling foul in my mouth, that I took advantage of a vulnerable old man. Finch leaned forward, his steepled fingers touching his chin. "And what they don't understand, Chester, is that Alistair was the least vulnerable man I've ever known. He saw people for exactly who they were. That was his gift, and his curse. It's why he had so few people around him. He couldn't stand charlatans. He chose you for a reason." He then said something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "Alistair named you not just as his heir, but as the executor of his will. He gave you the keys, Chester. Not just to his house, but to his entire life. He knew you might need them to defend his legacy. He trusted you to do it. As the executor, I had a legal duty to protect the estate from frivolous claims. It wasn't just my inheritance to defend. It was my job to see Alistair's final wishes through. After the meeting with Finch, I drove to the Abernethy mansion. It felt different this time. I used the key Mr. Finch had given me, a heavy, ornate brass key, and let myself in the front door. I had been in the house hundreds of times, but always through the service entrance, always with the quiet deference of an employee. Now the vast marble foyer echoed with my solitary footsteps. It was mine. The thought was still staggering. I walked past the grand ballroom and the formal dining room, places I'd only ever glimpsed, and went straight to the one room I knew almost as well as the inside of the Bentley, Mr. Abernethy's study. It was his sanctuary. The air smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and decaying paper. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with books on history, economics, and philosophy. And there, on a long, low credenza behind his massive mahogany desk, was what I was looking for. A row of identical dark green leather-bound journals, 40 years' worth. One for every year I had worked for him. Mr. Abernethy was a man of routine. Every night, before retiring, he would sit at his desk and write for exactly 1 hour. He called it downloading the day. I had often wondered what a man who spoke so little had so much to write about. I always assumed it was business, notes on the market, strategies for his empire. Now, as the executor and owner of these volumes, I had the right and perhaps the duty to read them. It felt like a profound violation of his privacy, a betrayal of the quiet trust we had shared. I ran my hand over the cool leather of the most recent volume. I could almost feel the presence of the old man in the room, watching me. I hesitated for a long time, just standing there in the silence. Then I remembered Mr. Finch's words. He knew you might need them. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was an act of defense. My family had fired the first shot in a war to define Alistair Abernethy's final years. They wanted to frame him as a victim. These journals, I suspected, held his side of the story. I took the most recent journal from the shelf and sat down in Mr. Finch Abernethy's worn leather chair. It still held the faint imprint of his body. With a deep breath, I opened it. The first few entries were mundane. Observations on the weather, notes on a stock he was watching, a complaint about the quality of modern television. But then I started to read about his life, his real life. He wrote about his loneliness, the suffocating weight of his own wealth, how it acted as a barrier between him and the rest of the world. He wrote with deep affection about his late wife, who had died 30 years prior. He wrote about his regrets, the businesses he'd crushed, the people he had failed to connect with. I spent days in that study, a bottle of water and a plate of sandwiches my only company. I went through the journals, year by year, backwards. I was looking for anything about Brenda or Marcus, but I found something else entirely. I found my friend. He wrote about our conversations. He noted my observations on traffic patterns with the same gravity he noted a market fluctuation. He wrote about the day I told him my wife Eleanor had passed away. Chester was quiet today, the entry read. A deep, profound sadness in his eyes that no words can touch. The silence in the car was heavier than usual. It was the silence of grief. I sent flowers. It felt inadequate. A man's worth is in his loyalties, and he has lost his greatest one. I must remember that. And then I found the subplot to his life, a secret dream he'd never shared with me directly. Tucked into a journal from 5 years ago was a detailed plan for a new charitable foundation. It wasn't for a hospital wing or an art museum. It was to be called the Abernethy Foundation for Applied Skills. Its sole purpose was to fund scholarships and create apprenticeships for young people who wanted to become mechanics, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, skilled tradespeople. He wrote, "The world is obsessed with university degrees, with creating managers and theorists. We've forgotten the dignity and importance of the people who can actually build and fix things. We praise the architect, but ignore the master stonemason. Chester can diagnose a problem in an engine by its sound alone. It is a form of genius the world no longer values. This foundation will be for the Chesters of the world. Tears welled in my eyes as I read that. He had seen me. He had seen the value in my life's work, a value my own family had been blind to. He had planned to build a legacy, inspired in part by me. The plan was meticulous, but it had never been filed. It was just a dream in a book, and in that moment, a new purpose bloomed in my heart. This wasn't about fighting for a fortune I could never spend. It was about fighting for his true legacy, the one he never got to build. Finally, after nearly a week of reading, I found what I was looking for. It was in a journal dated about 18 months ago. The entry began, "Marcus Morrison paid me a visit today." My blood ran cold. I read on, my heart pounding in my chest. Marcus had come to the mansion, using his relationship to me to get past the gate, and had pitched Mr. Abernathy on a new tech startup. He needed a $2 million seed investment. He had charts, projections, and a slick presentation. The journal entry continued, "The boy is ambitious. I'll give him that. He has the polish of a salesman, but his eyes are shifty. He reminds me of a young man I once knew who tried to sell me a bridge in Brooklyn. I told him I would have my people look into his proposal." The next entry, 2 days later, was the bombshell. "My due diligence on Marcus Morrison's venture is complete. It is, as I suspected, a complete fraud. The proprietary software is a pirated open-source code. The headquarters is a mailbox in Delaware. The creative financing model is a classic Ponzi scheme, designed to fleece early investors before the entire house of cards collapses. The documents he provided were riddled with forgeries, particularly the invoices for development work that was never done. He plans to wire the initial investment to an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. The boy is not a businessman. He is a common thief in an expensive suit. I have compiled a full dossier on the matter. I will not, of course, be investing. I will, however, keep this record. One never knows when a detailed account of a man's character might become useful. It is a sad thing to see a young man so thoroughly corrupt. He has all of his father's greed, but none of the work ethic." I sat back, the journal heavy in my hands. It was all there. A meticulous, damning account of my nephew's criminal enterprise, documented by one of the most respected financial minds in the world. He hadn't just rejected Marcus. He had investigated him, dissected his fraud, and preserved the evidence like a butterfly pinned to a board. And he had left it for me. This wasn't just leverage. This was a nuclear weapon, and my nephew, in his arrogance, had no idea it even existed. He thought he was dealing with a simple old driver. He had no idea I was now in possession of his eulogy, written by Alistair Abernathy himself. The fight was no longer about defending myself. It was about choosing the time and place to deploy the truth. My first move was one of pure cold silence, guided by Mr. Finch, who took a grim satisfaction in the plan. I began to act as a proper executor. The first thing to go was all the informal financial leakage from the estate. Brenda had been using a gas card linked to one of Mr. Abernathy's corporate accounts for years, a perk she thought was beneath the old man's notice. I had the account closed. She had also wrangled a membership at an exclusive country club, paid for by an Abernathy subsidiary under the guise of corporate entertainment. That was canceled immediately. Marcus had been doing something far more insidious. He was using the Abernathy name as a shield and a reference. He'd drop it in meetings to imply he had the backing of the Abernathy fortune, lending his shaky ventures an air of legitimacy. Finch's office sent a series of quiet, brutally formal cease-and-desist letters to Marcus and his known partners, stating that he had no affiliation, financial or otherwise, with the Abernathy estate. I didn't call them. I didn't text them. I just cut the cords, one by one. The fallout was almost instantaneous. The first text was from Brenda, A single confused question mark, likely sent from a gas station pump. An hour later, a frantic voicemail. Dad, my card was declined. The one for the car. There must be a mistake. You need to call them and fix it. Her tone wasn't angry yet, just annoyed, as if I were a slow-witted employee who had failed to perform a simple task. Marcus's reaction was more explosive. He called my phone, and when I didn't answer, he left a string of increasingly unhinged voicemails. Chester, what the hell is this? I just got a letter from Finch's office. What are you playing at? You're going to ruin my reputation. Pick up the phone, you old fool. You don't have the right to do this. That's family money you're messing with. You're going to regret this, Chester. When we win in court, I'm going to make sure you don't see a single dime. You'll be back in that musty little house with nothing. They were panicking. Their entire worldview was predicated on the idea that I was a simple, pliable man who could be intimidated. My silence, my refusal to engage with their drama, was something they couldn't process. They were used to shouting and getting a reaction. They were throwing rocks at a fortress, and the silence from within was driving them mad. They mistook my calm for fear, my strategy for incompetence. The final demand came a week later, a joint email from both Brenda and Marcus. They demanded a face-to-face meeting to resolve this unfortunate situation. Marcus, naturally, wrote the email, framing it as a final chance for me to come to my senses before they proceeded with the full force of the law. He suggested we meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop or a restaurant. I replied with a single sentence. I will meet you at the Abernathy residence, in the study tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I knew what that would do. It wasn't just a location, it was a statement. I was summoning them to my territory, to the seat of power. The battle was about to move from a series of skirmishes to the decisive engagement, and it would be on ground of my choosing. The silence had done its work. It had flushed them out of the woodwork, and now they were walking, willingly, into the trap. The next morning, I was waiting for them. I wasn't dressed in my old uniform, nor was I in the simple slacks and polo shirt that had been my off-duty attire for decades. At Mr. Finch's quiet suggestion, I had purchased a few new things. I was wearing a well-made, simple dark gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and no tie. I was comfortable, but I was no longer the chauffeur. I stood by the window of the study, watching their car pull up the long, winding driveway. It was Brenda's luxury SUV, the one I knew for a fact she was struggling to make payments on. They had never been this far up the drive before. I had always met them at the gatehouse. As they got out of the car, they paused, craning their necks to look up at the imposing stone facade of the mansion. Their faces were a mixture of awe, resentment, and naked greed. They looked at it as if it were already theirs, a prize they just had to pry from my senile old hands. I let them be shown in by the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who gave me a subtle, supportive nod as she led them down the hall. They walked into the study, and for a moment they were silenced by the room itself. The towering walls of books, the heavy velvet curtains, the sheer weight of history and power in the air seemed to suck the oxygen out of their arguments. Then their eyes landed on me. I wasn't standing meekly by the door. I was behind Mr. Abernathy's enormous mahogany desk. His desk, my desk. I didn't get up. I simply gestured to the two plush leather chairs opposite me. The chairs where supplicants and business rivals had sat for half a century. The power dynamic, the one that had governed our lives for 40 years, had not just shifted, it had been inverted. The physical geography of the room made it undeniable. Marcus recovered first, plastering on a condescending smile. Well, Chester, making yourself at home, I see. Brenda was more flustered. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the priceless paintings on the wall to the antique globe in the corner. Dad, this is too much for you. You can't possibly manage all this. Please, sit down, I said, my voice even and calm. It was a tone they had never heard from me before. It was the tone Mr. Abernethy used. Quiet, polite, and utterly non-negotiable. They sat. Marcus leaned forward, placing a sleek leather briefcase on the desk, a clear attempt to re-establish his authority. "All right, Chester," he began. "All business. We're here to offer you a way out. A generous one. My sister and I have spoken, and we're prepared to be reasonable." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "This is a settlement agreement. It's quite simple. You will cede control of 90% of the estate's liquid assets and stock holdings to a new family trust. I, of course, will act as trustee." He slid the papers across the polished wood. "In return, we will drop the legal challenge. We will allow you to live in this house for the remainder of your life, and we will provide you with a stipend of $100,000 a year. A very comfortable pension. It's more than you've ever earned in a year in your life." I didn't even look at the papers. I just looked at him. At the sheer breathtaking arrogance of the man-child sitting in front of me, offering me a pension from my own money. Brenda, sensing my silence was not one of compliance, tried a different approach. The emotional pincer movement. "Dad," she said, her voice softening, oozing a false sincerity that was more offensive than Marcus's open greed. "This isn't about us. It's about the family. It's about your grandchildren. This fortune, it can secure their future, their education, their homes, everything you always wanted for them. Don't you want to provide for them? This is your chance to give them the life you could never have." And that was it. That was the moment the last threadbare cord of familial obligation snapped. Using my grandchildren. Using my love for them as a bargaining chip. A weapon to manipulate me. It was the ugliest betrayal of all. In that instant, they ceased to be my daughter and nephew. They were just two hostile parties in a negotiation, and they had just revealed their weakest point. Their belief that my love was a weakness they could exploit. I looked at Brenda's pleading face and Marcus's smug one. The family Eleanor had begged me to keep together. Marcus started to fidget. His confidence wavering in the face of my utter stillness. Brenda's practiced look of concern began to curdle into impatience. "Well," instead, I slowly reached to my right. The contours formed the cool, smooth leather of a specific volume, the journal from 18 months ago. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk between us. I didn't open it. I just let it sit there. The air in the room changed. The confidence in Marcus's posture deflated like a punctured tire. Brenda just looked confused. "What's that?" My eyes were locked on Marcus. I saw the flicker of unease. Thor's shadow of a fear he couldn't yet name. Mr. Abernathy was a meticulous man, Marcus. He had a remarkable memory for detail. I leaned forward slightly. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He was very impressed by your ambition. Creative way you were invoicing for software development. Brenda looked from me to Marcus, her brow furrowed in confusion. Marcus, what is he talking about? But Marcus couldn't answer. His eyes were glued to the journal. He knew. In that instant, he knew. He might not have known that Mr. Abernathy had written it all down, but he knew the truth of what I was saying. He knew the entire fraudulent edifice of his life was about to come crashing down. I let the silence stretch again, letting the reality of his predicament sink in. Then I delivered the final quiet blow. As the executor of this estate, I said, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, I have a legal and fiduciary duty to protect it from all claims. If you proceed with this challenge to the will, our lawyers will be forced to enter evidence to establish Mr. Abernathy's state of mind at the time the will was written, to prove he was sharp, observant, and a sound judge of character. I patted the journal. This entire volume, along with Mr. Abernathy's full dossier on your business, would become Exhibit A, part of the public record. I imagine your current investors, not to mention the district attorney, would find his analysis illuminating. It was over. The fight went out of Marcus in a single visible shudder. His arrogance, his condescension, his blustering rage, it all evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a man who was utterly and completely trapped. He looked small, pathetic, a cheap suit filled with fear. Brenda was still sputtering. Dad, this is blackmail. You can't. No, Brenda, I said, turning my gaze to her for the first time. It was a cold, hard look she had never seen from me before. It's not blackmail. It's called discovery. It's the consequence of your actions. You and Marcus started a war to get this money. You just didn't realize I had been handed all the ammunition. I stood up, the chair scraping softly on the hardwood floor. The meeting is over. You will have your lawyer withdraw the challenge to the will by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If he does not, Mr. Finch has my full authority to file his defense, starting with this journal. I turned and walked to the window, my back to them, a clear and final dismissal. I heard the scrape of chairs, a whispered, frantic argument, and then the sound of their footsteps retreating down the long hall. The front door opened and then closed with a heavy final thud, and the mansion was silent once more. The call from Mr. Finch came at 8:45 the next morning. The legal challenge had been officially withdrawn. A one-sentence email from their lawyer had confirmed it. No explanation, no apology. Just a quiet, unconditional surrender. I hung up the phone, and a feeling I hadn't expected washed over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was just peace. A deep, profound quiet settled in my soul. The war was over. I had won, but it felt less like a victory and more like the end of a long, debilitating illness. I spent the rest of that day simply walking through the house, not as its owner, but as its caretaker. I ran my hand along the polished wood of the grand staircase, looked at the faces in the old portraits, and stood in the quiet gardens, listening to the birds. This immense wealth wasn't a prize I had won. It was a responsibility I had inherited. It was a tool, and I knew exactly what I was going to build with it. My first official act as master of the Abernathy estate was to call Mr. Finch and instruct him to begin the legal process of establishing the Abernathy Foundation for Applied Skills. The dream I had found in that journal would not die with him. It would be his true legacy. And mine. We would fund scholarships for kids who wanted to be welders, not bankers. We would build state-of-the-art training centers for electricians and mechanics. We would celebrate the dignity of real work, the kind of work my family had been ashamed of for 40 years. They say that money changes people, but I don't think that's true. I think money is an accelerant. It doesn't change you. It just makes you more of who you already were. My family had always been greedy and entitled. The prospect of a fortune just stripped away their thin veneer of civility. Alistair Abernathy had always been a private man who valued loyalty and character above all else. His will was the ultimate expression of that belief. And me, I suppose I was always a man who valued quiet loyalty and a job well done. Now I just have a much bigger job. It's a bittersweet reality, of course. I have financial freedom beyond my wildest dreams, but I've lost the family I thought I had. But as I sit here now, in this quiet study, looking out over the sprawling green lawns, I realize you can't lose something you never truly possessed. My family saw a uniform, a chauffeur, a servant. They saw a function, not a man. Mr. Abernathy saw a friend. He saw me. In the end, his was the only judgment that truly mattered. I spent 40 years serving one good man, and now I'll spend the rest of my life serving his legacy. And for the first time, I feel completely and utterly my own man. So what do you think? Did I do the right thing? Should I have been more generous, or was my response completely justified? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. Thank you for listening.